Chapter 18. Once off the trail, Matt felt as if he had entered an unending maze of trees and bushes. He, Tony, and Hooter tripped over logs and fell over one another in their struggle to keep up with the Indians. Matt marveled at the ease with which his guides moved through the difficult terrain. They never seemed to take an awkward step. Each movement was light and graceful in comparison to his own clumsy gait. After what seemed like hours of forging through forest, the Indians stopped by a small grove of trees. "What are they stopping for?" Tony whispered. They sat watching as one of the Indians untied the bag of berries that hung from his waist. He put the bag under his foot and stepped on it. Then he took his finger and dipped it in the bag. When he took his finger out, it was bright red, and he brought the reddened finger up to his face. "Wow! War paint!" Hooter exclaimed on seeing the bright red slashes across the Indian's cheeks. Matt sat transfixed, watching the Indian boys decorate their faces. When he was younger, Matt had used his finger paints, pretending to paint himself up like an Indian warrior. Now he could hardly believe he was seeing the real thing. "Do you think it's really war paint?" Tony asked. "Shh! Shh!" One of the Indians suddenly whispered. He had begun to scout ahead, and had just turned around to signal them. Matt and the others stood watching as the Indian picked up a stick and held it like a gun. "The Hessians!" Matt whispered to Hooter and Tony. Then the Indian signaled for them to follow. Matt and the boys carefully made their way behind him, as soundlessly as they could. The Indian stopped at a large group of bushes. Standing in the cover of the shrubbery, one of them silently pointed to the right. Matt followed his gaze to see Katie and Q sitting around a campfire that was just above a creek. 3 Hessian grenadiers in blue and white uniforms were sitting beside them. Matt sighed with relief on seeing his sister. Then he looked over to the soldiers. So those are the bloodthirsty giants, he thought. They did seem imposing in their fine uniforms and heavy black boots that went up past their knees. The men had strong, broad faces with thick mustaches. As one of the soldiers stood up to tend the fire, Matt could see that he was no taller than most men, and if anything, a bit on the short side. Then the soldier reached for his black fur hat that was on the ground. So that's why they look like giants, Matt thought, on seeing the soldier put on the long, cone-shaped hat. It stood almost 2 feet above his head. Matt looked over at the 3 muskets that stood leaning against a tree. Their bayonets were polished to a high gleam. While they weren't the bloodthirsty giants he was expecting, Matt could see that these Hessians were still a formidable foe. Their uniforms and weapons were those of the professional soldier, and unlike the ragged American rebels, Matt knew that these soldiers had been highly trained for professional warfare. The Indian boys seemed to sense this too, and began to back away. "No, we can't leave," Matt pleaded. "I have to rescue my sister." But the Indians shook their heads and turned around, disappearing into the woods. Matt, Tony, and Hooter stood staring after them. "What did they put all that war paint on for, if they aren't going to stay and fight?" Hooter whispered. "I guess it wasn't war paint," Matt muttered. "I hate to say it," Hooter whispered, "but I think they have the right idea. We're no match for these guys. Maybe we could catch up if we hurry," he said, turning around in the direction of the Indians. "Tony, where's your sense of loyalty?" Matt exclaimed, grabbing his sleeve. "That's Katie and Q over there. They are fellow club members, part of our tribe, don't you see? The Indians risked their lives to get us here. Now it's up to us to save our people." "But we don't even have any weapons to save them with," Tony moaned. "Those soldiers have guns and swords." "We have courage and sticks. Just pick up a big stick," Matt ordered. "A stick?" Tony whimpered. "Did he say a stick?" "Maybe we could convince them that we're friends," Hooter suggested. "It looks like Q is trying to do just that," Matt whispered, pointing to Q, who had just stood up. The boys watched in horror as one of the soldiers suddenly drew his sword and began to shout. Q stood shaking his head. "I don't know what you want," he cried as another soldier reached over and began going through his pockets. The soldier said something in German and then pulled out a small object from Q's back pocket. "What is it?" Hooter whispered. "What did he get?" "I don't know," Matt replied. "It's too small to see. But whatever it is, it sure has them interested." The other 2 soldiers had gathered together to look down at the strange object in their comrade's hand. A look of confusion came over their faces as they tried to figure out just what the purpose of the object was. "Was ist das?" one of the soldiers demanded, looking back at Q. It's a piece of bubble gum," Q blurted out. The soldier turned the gum over several times and then unwrapped it. He stood for a long while, squinting down at the tiny comic that was printed on the inside wrapper. As Matt looked on from the bushes, he noticed that this Hessian soldier was a young burly man, with broad shoulders and a thick neck. He had a bushy brown mustache and ruddy red cheeks. His eyes were a clear crystal blue. The officer reminded Matt of Tommy from Custom Car Wash, which was just down the street from Matt's house. Matt wondered what this officer would look like washing a car. He imagined him with a hose in his hand instead of a sword. He imagined that he would look just like Tommy, except for the mustache. The officer suddenly looked up and smiled. "It must have been a good comic," Hooter whispered, as they watched a smiling soldier hold the gum up before Q. "It's for chewing," Q tried to explain. He pointed to his mouth and began to chew. The officer nodded and brought the gum to his nose. He smiled again, inhaling the sweet watermelon scent. Watermelon was Q's favorite flavor. The officer broke off half of the gum and handed it to Q, motioning for him to put it in his mouth. "What does he think it is? Poison?" Hooter whispered. "He doesn't even speak English. He probably feels like he can't trust anyone," Matt whispered back. They watched Q take the gum and put it in his mouth. All the soldiers fixed their gaze on Q, who was chewing as fast as he could. "Now comes the best part," Q said, his voice quivering with fear. He closed his eyes and blew a big pink bubble. The soldiers all stood gaping at the strange sight of the American boy with a pink bubble coming out of his mouth. They all jumped when the bubble broke with a loud bang. Q motioned for the soldier with the gum to try it himself. "Just take a few chews, and then you can blow a bubble yourself," Q said, pointing to the gum in the soldier's hand. The curious Hessian couldn't resist the opportunity. He slowly brought the gum to his mouth and licked it with his tongue. "Das ist gut," the soldier exclaimed. He chewed it several times and swallowed it. "No," Q said, shaking his head. "You aren't supposed to swallow it. It's just for chewing and blowing bubbles." The soldier frowned and pointed to Q's pocket. "I haven't any more," Q told him. "Honest, that was my last piece," he cried as the soldier began searching his other pockets. When he pulled out a weighted dollar bill, the soldier carefully unfolded it and stood staring at the face that was printed on the middle of the bill. A chill ran through Matt as he knew what was coming next. "Rebel," the Hessian said sternly. "I'm not a rebel," the boys could hear Q trying to explain. "That's just a dollar bill from my allowance." "Can't they see he's not old enough to be a soldier?" Tony whispered. "It doesn't matter," Matt told him. "When I worked on my history report, I read that there were a lot of American boys used as spies and runners for the rebels. If they think that Q is a spy, there is no telling what they'll do to him. We've got to come up with a plan." As they watched from the bushes, the boys could see that the soldiers had laid down their muskets and were busy inspecting George Washington's portrait on the dollar bill. "If that dollar bill can hold their attention long enough, we'll be able to sneak in, take their guns, and ambush them," Matt said, trying to sound as confident as he could. "We will?" Tony squeaked. "Are you sure you don't want to give this some more thought?" Hooter whispered. "We don't have time for any more thought," Matt said, shaking his head. "This may be our only chance." "But we don't even know how to shoot those muskets," Tony objected. "That's true," Matt said, "but the Hessians don't know that. All we have to do is point them in their direction, and they'll probably surrender to us." "Probably?" Tony asked, shaking his head. "Don't worry, Tony," Hooter said, putting his arm around his little friend. "Matt knows what he's doing. Don't you, Chief?" Sure," Matt gulped. He tried to look as courageous as he could for the sake of Tony and Hooter, but his stomach hurt, and he felt like crying. Matt thought of all the brave men he had met last night, and hoped he could show as much courage now. He took a step forward. Hooter followed, with Tony nervously clinging to his arm. Within seconds they reached the campfire. The soldiers were huddled together, inspecting the bill as their muskets stood propped against a tree. Matt could hear Hooter's heavy breathing behind him, and he knew that one wrong move could well be their last. When they reached the tree, Matt took a deep breath and reached for a musket. Tony and Hooter did the same. At the sound of their footsteps, the Hessians swung around and drew their swords. Katie screamed, Q yelled, and Matt did the one thing that he had so hoped he wouldn't. He closed his eyes and didn't move. Chapter 19. "I've got to open my eyes. I've got to," Matt was thinking frantically as he tried to find the courage to face the enemy. He had only been standing like that for an instant when he heard Katie call his name. On opening his eyes, he saw one of the grenadiers about to charge Hooter with his sword. "Who? Look out!" Matt yelled as he reached for a big stick that was on the ground. He threw it at the soldier, but missed him, hitting Hooter instead. Tony and Q knelt down beside Hooter as he lay moaning on the ground. The soldiers waved their swords and shouted until Matt and the boys put their hands up over their heads. "We give up," Matt cried. "We give up." The The Hessian seemed to understand and accepted their surrender. "Sorry," Matt whispered as Hooter stood beside him, holding his hand over the cut on his head. The soldiers motioned for everyone to form a line, but Katy ran to Matt and wouldn't let go of his leg. One of the soldiers, a man with bright red hair and a mustache, yelled something in German at her, but she wouldn't leave Matt's side. The soldier lifted his sword and growled. Katy began to sob but didn't budge. The soldier took a step toward them. Suddenly, one of the other soldiers reached out and grabbed his comrade's arm. He spoke in a low, calm voice. The red-headed soldier lowered his sword and backed away. Katy's sobs had quieted down to a whimper. The other Hessian came over to them and patted Katy on the head. Then he turned to Matt and asked, "Das who?" Das Katy. Her name is Katy," Matt said. "Katy, ja, das Katy." The soldier looked down at Katy and grinned. Then he walked over to Hooter, who stood holding his head. There was a short gash on Hooter's forehead, and it was bleeding down the side of his face. The soldier pulled a rag from his pocket and offered it to him. "Das who?" He looked at Hooter. "Hooter," Hooter replied as he put the rag to his forehead. The soldier laughed. "Hoot, hoot," he repeated. When Hooter lifted the rag, his cut was still bleeding. He turned to the soldier. "If you don't mind," he said, "that is, if it would be okay with you, could I just put a little Band-Aid on it?" "Where are you going to get a Band-Aid?" Q whispered. "Right here," Hooter whispered back, slowly putting his hand in his pocket. The soldier shouted on seeing him reach into his pocket, and poked him with the musket. Hooter quickly pulled out the Band-Aid and held it up in his trembling fingers. The soldiers gathered around him as he opened the wrapper. "It's okay," Hooter assured them. "It's just a Band-Aid." He pulled the end tabs off the Band-Aid and placed it over his cut. The soldiers took turns running their fingers over the smooth plastic surface. They shook their heads, bewildered at the strange material that stuck by itself to Hooter's forehead. Everyone suddenly looked up at the sound of an approaching deer. It was a large buck that had come to the creek for a drink. Once it had picked up on their scent, however, it bolted over some low bushes and ran off into the forest. The soldiers decided to try and follow the deer, since they hadn't eaten meat in many days. It was agreed that 2 of the soldiers would go after the deer, while the remaining soldier would take the children back to camp. Matt was glad they hadn't been left with the red-headed soldier, for he had looked mean. This soldier seemed much kinder. He had them march in a single file, though he allowed Katy to walk at Matt's side. He even let them talk amongst themselves when they stopped to rest. They knew that he couldn't understand English, and so were able to talk freely in front of him. It was a slow march through the woods, and they stopped several times to rest as the day wore on. "At least we're all together, finally," Matt sighed when they had come to another stop. "Yeah, great," Tony whispered, "and now we can all die together." "I want Mommy, Matty-O," Katy cried on hearing this. She clutched Matt's leg. "It's okay, Katy. No one is going to die," Matt whispered. He turned around to face Tony. "No one in this club is going to die. Do you understand? I'm going to get us out of this. I promise." "How are you going to get us back home? Back to the 20th century, Tony wanted to know. "The rowboat," Q said. "If we find the rowboat, maybe we can get back home." "Maybe?" Matt asked, turning to Q. "I'm afraid it's only a maybe," Q told him. "Adam Hibbs said his grandfather had traveled through many different time periods in the old rowboat before he found this one." "Wow," Matt whispered. "Wow. I guess it seemed like such a fantastic story that no one but his grandson believed him," Q added. "But did Adam Hibbs ever try and get back to his own time?" Matt wanted to know. "No, he decided to stay in this one," Q replied. "Why?" Tony asked. From what Adam said, the young Adam, that is, his grandmother was very pretty. He said that his grandfather took one look at her and decided that the 1700s would be as good a time as any to call home. "Oh, yuck," Tony said, making a face. "After he decided to stay in this time," Q continued, "he hid the boat, but someone else must have found it, because it disappeared and he never saw it again." He told his grandson the whole story, and the young Adam had been looking out for the old boat ever since he was a boy. "But Q, did he tell you how his grandfather knew where the boat would take him? Did he have any control over what time he could travel to?" Matt asked. Q shook his head. "He was getting to that, but his voice got so low, I just couldn't make out the words. Something about the mind. It was the last thing he was trying to tell me before he closed his eyes and, well, stopped talking," Q said, looking away. "Oh, great," Matt moaned. "Now we just have to find the rowboat and take our chances." "What do you mean, take our chances?" Hooter wanted to know. He means maybe we'll get back to our time and maybe we won't, Tony told him. And if we don't, there's no telling where we'll end up, Q said. I want to go home, Katie cried. I want Mommy. Shh, Katie, don't worry, Matt said, bending down to hug her. I'm here with you, and we'll find a way to get back home to Mom and Dad. Really, we will. He looked up to see the worried faces of Tony, Hooter, and Q. We'll do it, we will, he tried to assure them. But first we have to get ourselves away from these Hessians and back with the American army, he whispered. Where are they? Hooter wanted to know. All I see is trees and more trees. And even if we did know where the rebels were, how are we supposed to get to them? He hasn't let go of that musket since we started, Tony said, nodding to the Hessian. As he looked over at the soldier, Matt tried to guess his age. If he took away the mustache, he thought to himself, he wouldn't look much older than Israel. Matt couldn't get the young soldier out of his mind. Why do you suppose the Hessians came all the way over here from Germany to fight in a war they don't know anything about? He whispered to Q. Well, King George was running out of British troops to send over to America, so he paid the Germans to send some of their troops, Q told him. Do you think they're really as bloodthirsty as the rebels say? Matt asked. I don't know, Q answered. I suppose some are and some aren't. But by the looks of this one, I'd say they're a lot like any other soldier. They're just trained differently. I remember reading about it for our report. Actually, many of their soldiers were young boys who lived on farms and needed the money, or wanted to become somebody special. Like a Marine? Hooter asked. I guess you could say they were like Marines, Q nodded. I wouldn't mind being a Marine and protecting my country, Hooter said, as long as I wouldn't have to hurt anybody. I don't think it works like that, Matt smiled, but he knew what Hooter meant. Suddenly the soldier sighed loudly and pulled up his pant leg, just above the boot line. He had walked through some thorny bushes, and his leg was beginning to bleed. Hooter reached into his pocket and pulled out the biggest Band-Aid he had. He always carried Band-Aids, in case he met someone who needed one. And he always carried 3 different sizes. Excuse me, sir, he said loudly. But would you like a Band-Aid? He waved it in the air in front of the soldier. Band-Aid? Band-Aid, he said. He waited to see the soldier's response, and when the Hessian beckoned him forward, Hooter stood up. He went to the soldier and opened the Band-Aid and carefully placed it over the bloodiest part of the wound. The leg was pretty badly scratched, but the Band-Aid was able to stop the severest bleeding. The soldier stared at the Band-Aid for a long time and pulled at the edges, feeling the sticky underside. Then he looked at Hooter. Bandad? Hoot? He smiled at Hooter and then tapped himself on the chest. Ich bin Gustav. Gustav, that's great, Hooter grinned. Hi, Gustav. Nice to meet you. Ja, hoot, the soldier grinned back. Then he stood up and had them form into a line again. Hooter, we aren't at a tea party, Matt said sternly, as they began to make their way through the woods. We're not supposed to be making friends with them. That's the enemy. He nodded warily back at the soldier. They continued the march in silence until the sounds of rushing water filled their ears. As they came into a clearing, they found themselves suddenly standing on the banks of the Delaware. It's the river, Matt whispered. This is probably our best chance to meet up with the army. He turned around to look at Gustav. The soldier had a confused look on his face, as if he were lost. He pointed his musket down the shoreline and mumbled something in German. The weary prisoners trudged on down to the shore and walked along the water's edge. They had only walked a few yards when they came upon a fat beaver building a dam. The beaver was off to the left side of the shore and was so intent on his work that he took no notice of the group. Even Gustav seemed to be interested, as they all stopped to observe the industrious animal. Katie stood beside Matt, but her attention was diverted to a family of wild ducks that were floating on the river. She took a few steps in their direction. As everyone was preoccupied with watching the beaver, they failed to see Katie moving closer to the river's edge. When she spotted a baby duck in the group, she stepped further out onto the ice, hoping to get a better look. Help! Katie cried suddenly as the thin ice cracked and her left leg disappeared into a hole. Before Matt could move, he saw that Gustav was up and running to the edge of the ice. Don't move, Matt called out to Katie, who was struggling to free her leg. He and the rest of the boys had rushed over and were now gathered along the shore watching, as Gustav bravely made his way onto the thin ice. Matt knew that if the ice cracked and Gustav fell through, he would surely die. But the Hessian soldier didn't hesitate for a moment. His eyes were riveted to each step he took, knowing full well that the next step could well be his last. When he reached Katie, he pulled her leg free and quickly carried her off the ice that shuddered and cracked beneath his feet. It was the bravest thing that Matt had ever seen anyone do. Once they had reached solid ground, Gustav put Katie down and she ran crying to Matt. Katie, Matt scolded as he picked her up. You managed to get yourself in more trouble than the whole club put together. You could have drowned. Matt looked over guiltily at the Hessian soldier. He felt bad about his earlier remark, referring to Gustav as the enemy. He knew he should thank him for saving Katie's life, but he was too embarrassed to go up to him, though Hooter was not. "Thanks, Gustav," Hooter cried, holding his hand out to the soldier. Gustav smiled and shook Hooter's hand. "That was really brave." But Hooter's voice was suddenly silenced by the sound of musket fire. He and the rest of the club looked on in horror as Gustav cried out in pain, for a musket ball had ripped through his back. He took a step, then fell forward, toppling to the ground with his face in the snow. "Cease your fire! The rest are just children," came a loud voice. Matt and the others stood staring, wide-eyed, as a group of rebel soldiers came out of the woods. A skinny-looking corporal went up to Gustav and poked him hard with his musket. "I don't think this Hessian will be causing us much trouble now," he called back to his comrades with a grin. "You see, boys," he continued, "here is the one Hessian you can trust."